Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, An Inquiry into Values, by Robert M Persig, Chapter 22. The next morning we check out of the hotel feeling refreshed, say goodbye to the Deweeses, and head north on the open road out of Bozeman. The Deweeses wanted us to stay, but a particular itching to move west and get on with my thoughts has taken over. I want to talk today about a person whom Phaedrus never heard of, but whose writings I've studied quite extensively in preparation for this Chautauqua. Unlike Phaedrus, this man was an international celebrity at 35, a living legend at 58, whom Bertrand Russell has described by general agreement the most eminent scientific man of his generation. He was an astronomer, a physicist, a mathematician, and a philosopher all in one. His name was Jules Henry Poincaré. It always seemed incredible to me that, and still does, I guess, that Phaedrus should have traveled along a line of thought that had never been traveled before. Someone, somewhere, must have thought of all of this before, and Phaedrus was such a poor scholar that it would have been just like him to have duplicated the commonplaces of some famous system of philosophy he hadn't taken the trouble to look into. So I spent more than a year reading into the very long and sometimes very tedious history of philosophy in a search for duplicate ideas. It was a fascinating way to read the history of philosophy, however, and a thing occurred of which I still don't know quite what to make. Philosophical systems that are supposed to be greatly opposed to one another both seem to say something very close to what Phaedrus thought, with minor variations. Time after time I thought I'd found whom he was duplicating, but each time, because of what appeared to be some slight differences, he took a greatly different direction. Hegel, for example, whom I referred to earlier, was rejected Hindu systems of philosophy as no philosophy at all. Phaedrus seemed to assimilate them, or be assimilated by them. There was no feeling of contradiction. Eventually I came to Poincaré. Here again there was a little duplication, but another kind of phenomenon. Phaedrus follows a long and tortuous path into the highest abstractions, seems about to come down and then stops. Poincaré starts with the most basic scientific verities, works up the same abstractions, and then stops. Both trails stop right at each other's end. There's a perfect continuity between them. When you live in the shadow of insanity, the appearances of another mind that thinks and talks as yours does is something close to a blessed event, like Robinson Crusoe's discovery of footprints on sand. Poincaré lived from 1854 to 1912, a professor in the University of Paris. His beard and princeness were reminiscent of Henry Toulouse-Lautrec, who lived in Paris at the same time and was only 10 years younger. During Poincaré's lifetime, an alarmingly deep crisis in the foundations of the exact sciences had begun. For years, scientific truth had been beyond possibility of a doubt. The logic of science was infallible. And if scientists were sometimes mistaken, this was assumed to be only from their mistaking its rules. The great questions have all been answered. The mission of science was now simply to refine these answers to a greater and greater accuracy. True, there were still unexplained phenomena such as radioactivity, transmission of light through ether, and the peculiar relationship of magnetic to electric forces. But these, if past trends were any indication, have all eventually to fall. It was hardly guessed by anyone that within a few decades there would be no more absolute space, absolute time, absolute substance, or even absolute magnitude. That classical physics, the scientific rock of ages, would become approximate. And that the soberest and most respected of astronomers would be telling mankind that if it looked long enough through a telescope powerful enough, that it would see the back of its own head. The basis of the foundation-shattering theory of relativity was as yet understood by only very few, of whom Poincaré, at the most eminent mathematician of his time, was one. In his Foundations of Science, Poincaré explained that the antecedents of the crisis in the foundations of science were very old. It had long been sought in vain, he said, to demonstrate the axiom known as Euclid's fifth postulate, and this search was the start of the crisis. Euclid's postulate of parallels, which states that through a given point there's not more than one parallel line to a given straight line. We usually learn in 10th grade geometry. Euclid's postulate of parallels, which states that through a given point there's not more than one parallel line to a given straight line. We usually learn in 10th grade geometry. It is one of the basic building blocks by which the entire mathematics of geometry is constructed. All other axioms seem to be obvious and seem to be so obvious as yet to be unquestionable, but this one did not. Yet you couldn't get rid of it without destroying huge portions of the mathematics. And no one seemed to be able to reduce it to anything more elementary. What the effort had been wasted in chimeric hope was truly unimaginable, Poincaré said. Finally, in the first quarter of the 19th century, and almost at the same time, a Hungarian-Russian, Bolyai, Lobachevsky established irrefutably a proof that Euclid's fifth postulate is impossible. And they did this by reasoning that if there were ever any way to reduce Euclid's postulate to another surer axioms, another effect would also be noticeable. A reversal of Euclid's postulate would create logical contradictions in geometry. So they reversed Euclid's postulates. This last one, postulate. Lobachevsky assumes at the start through a given point can be drawn two parallels to give a straight. He retains besides all Euclid's other axioms. From these hypotheses, he deduces a series of theorems, among which it's impossible to find any contradiction, and he constructs a geometry with faultless logic is inferior in nothing to that of the Euclidean geometry. Thus, by his failure to find any contradictions, he proves that the fifth postulate is irreducible to simpler axioms. It wasn't the proof that was alarming, it was the rational byproduct that soon overshadowed it and almost everything else in the field of mathematics. Mathematics, the cornerstone of scientific certainty, was suddenly uncertain. We now had two contradictory visions of unshakable scientific truth, true for all men of all ages, regardless of their individual preferences. This is the basis of the profound crisis that shattered the scientific complacency of the Gilded Age. How do we know which one of these geometries is right? If there is no basis for distinguishing between them, then you have a total mathematics which limits logical contradictions. But a mathematics that admits internal logical contradictions is no mathematics at all. The ultimate effect of the non-Euclidean geometries becomes nothing more than a magician's mumbo-jumbo to which belief is sustained purely by faith. And of course, once that door is open, one could hardly expect the number of contradictory systems of unshakable scientific truth to be limited to two. A German named Riemann appeared with another unshakable system of geometry, which throws overboard not only Euclid's postulate, but also the first axiom, which states that only this one straight line can pass through 2 points. And again, there was no internal contradiction, only an inconsistency with both Lobachevskian and Euclidean geometries. According to the theory of relativity, Riemann geometry best describes the world we live in. At 3 forks, the road cuts into a narrow canyon of a whitish tan rock, and we pass the Lewis and Clark caves, east of Butte, and we go up a long, hard grade across the continental divide and go down into a valley. Later, we pass the stack of the Anaconda smelter, turn into the town of Anaconda, and find a good restaurant with steak and coffee. We go up the long grade that leads to a lake surrounded by pine forests, and some fishermen who push a small boat into the water. And then the road winds down again and through the pine forest, and I see the angle of the sun at the morning is almost ended. We pass through Phillipsburg and are off into the valley meadows, and the headwind becomes more gusty here, so I slow down to 55 and lessen it a little. We go through Maxville by the time we reach Hull are badly in need of a rest. We find a churchyard by the other side of the road and stop. The wind is blowing hard now and is chilly, but the sun is warm and we lay out our jackets and helmets on the grass, leeward side of the church for a rest. It's very lonely and open here, but beautiful. When you have mountains in the distance or even hills, you have space. Chris turns his face into his jacket and tries to sleep. Everything is so different now without the Sutherlands. So lonely. If you'll excuse me, I'll just talk with the Chautauqua now, until the loneliness goes away. To solve the problem of what is mathematical truth, Poincaré said, you should first ask yourselves what the nature of geometric axioms. Are they synthetic a priori judgments, as Kant said? That is, they do exist do they exist as a fixed part of a man's consciousness, independently of experience and uncreated by experience? and uncreated by experience? Poincaré thought not. They would then impose themselves upon us with such force that we couldn't conceive the contrary proposition, or build upon it a theoretic edifice. There would be no non-Euclidean geometry. Should we therefore conclude that the axioms of geometry are experimental varieties? Verities? Poincaré didn't think that was so either. If they were, they would be subject to continual change and revision as the new laboratory data came in. This seemed to be contrary to the whole nature of geometry itself. Poincaré said that the axioms of geometry were conventions, or choice among all the possible conventions is guided by experimental facts, but it remains free and is limited only by the necessity of avoiding all contradictions. Thus it is that the postulates can remain rigorously true even though the experimental laws that have determined their adoption are only approximate. The axioms of geometry, in other words, are merely disguised definitions. Then, having identified the nature of geometric axioms, he turned to the question, is Euclidean geometry true, or is Riemannian geometry true? He answered, the question has no meaning. As well ask whether the metric system is true and the Avogadro-Dupas system is false. Whether or not the Cartesian coordinates are true and the polar coordinates are false, one geometry can be more true than another. It can only be cannot be more true than another. It can only be more convenient. Geometry is not true. It is advantageous. Poincaré went on to demonstrate the conventional nature of other concepts of science, such as space and time, showing that there isn't one way of measuring these entities that is more true than another. That which is generously adopted is only more convenient. Generally adopted is only more convenient. Our concepts of space and time are also definitions selected on the basis of their convenience in handling the facts. The radical understanding of our most basic scientific concepts is not yet complete, however. The mystery of what is space and time may be made more understandable by this explanation, but now the burden of sustaining the order of the universe rests on facts. What are facts? Poincaré proceeded to examine these critically. Which facts are you going to observe, he asked. There is an infinity of them. There is no more chance that an unselective observation of facts will produce science than there is a monkey at a typewriter will produce Lord's Prayer. The same is true of hypotheses. Which hypotheses? Poincaré wrote. If a phenomenon admits of complete mechanical explanation, it will admit of an infinity of others which will account equally well for the peculiarities disclosed by experiment. This was a statement made by Phaedrus in the laboratory. It raised the question that failed him out of school. If the scientist had at his disposal infinite time, Poincaré said, it would only be necessary to say to him, look and notice well. But as there isn't time to see everything, and it's better to not see them than to see wrongly, it's necessary for him to make a choice. Poincaré laid down some rules. There is a hierarchy of facts. The more general a fact, the more precious it is. Those which serve many times are better than those which have little chance of coming up again. Biologists, for example, would be at a loss to construct science if only individuals and no species existed. If the heredity didn't make children like parents. Which facts are likely to reappear? The simple facts. How to recognize them? Choose those that seem simple. Either this simplicity is real, or the complex elements are indistinguishable. In that first case, we're likely to meet this simple fact again, either alone or as an element in a complex fact. The second case has a good chance of recurring. Science nature doesn't randomly construct such cases. Where is the simple fact? Scientists have been seeking it in the two extremes, in the infinitely great and in the infinitely small. Biologists, for example, have been instinctively led to regard the cell as more interesting than the whole animal, and since Poincaré's time, the protein molecule as more interesting than the cell. The outcome has shown the wisdom of this, since cells and molecules belong to different organisms, and have been found to be more alike than organisms themselves. How then choose the interesting fact, and the one that begins again and again? Method is precisely the choice of facts. It is needful then to be occupied with first with creating a method, and many have been imagined, since none imposes itself. It's proper to begin with regular facts, but after a rule is established beyond all doubt, the facts in conformity with it become dull because they no longer teach us anything new. Then its exception becomes important. We seek not resemblances but differences, choose the most accentuated differences because they're the most striking and the most instructive. We first seek the cases in which this rule has the greatest chance of failing, and going very far away in space or very far away in time, we may find our usual rules entirely overturned, and these grand overturnings enable us the better to see the little changes that may happen nearer to us. But what we ought to aim at is less the ascertainment of resemblances and differences than the recognition of likeness hidden under apparent divergences. Particular rules seem at first discordant, but then looking more carefully we can see in general that they resemble each other, different as to matter. They are alike as to form, as to order of their parts. When we look at them with this bias, we shall see them enlarge and tend to embrace everything. And this is what makes the value of certain facts that come to complete an assemblage, and to show that it is the faithful image of other known assemblages. No, Poincaré concluded, the scientist does not choose at random the facts he observes. He seeks to condense much experience and much thought into a slender volume. And that's why a little book on physics contains so many past experiences with 1,000 times as many possible experiences whose result is known beforehand. Then Poincaré illustrated how a fact is discovered. He had described generally how scientists arrive at facts and theories, but now he penetrated narrowly into his own personal experience with the mathematical functions that established from his early fame. For 15 days, he said, he strove to prove that there couldn't be any such functions. Every day he seated himself at his work table, stayed an hour or two, and tried a great number of combinations and reached no results. Then one evening, contrary to his custom, he drank black coffee and couldn't sleep. Ideas arose in crowds, and he felt them collide until pairs interlocked, so to speak, making a stable combination. The next morning he had only to write out the results. A wave of crystallization had taken place. He described how a second wave of crystallization, guided by analogies to established mathematics, produced what he later named the Theta Fuchsian series. He left Caen, where he was living, to go to a geologic exertion. The changes of travel made him forget mathematics. He was about to enter a bus, and at that moment when he put his foot on the step, the idea came to him, without anything in his former thoughts, having paved the way for it, that the information he had used to define the Fuchsian functions were identical to those of non-Euclidean geometry. He didn't verify the idea, he said. He just went on with the conversion on the bus, but he felt a perfect certainty. Later he verified the result at his leisure. A later discovery occurred while he was walking by a seaside bluff. It came to him with just the same characteristics of brevity, suddenness, and immediate certainty. Another major discovery occurred while he was walking down a street. Others eulogized his process of mysterious workings of a genius, but Poincaré was not content with such a shallow explanation. He tried to fathom more deeply what had happened. Mathematics, he said, isn't merely just a question of applying rules, any more than science. It doesn't merely make the most combinations possible according to certain fixed laws. The combinations so obtained to be exceedingly numerous, useless, and cumbersome. The true work of the inventor consists in choosing among these combinations so as to eliminate the useless ones, or rather to avoid the trouble of making them. And the rules that must guide the choice are extremely fine and delicate. It's almost impossible to state them precisely. They must be felt rather than formulated. Poincaré then hypothesized that this selection is made by what he called subliminal self, an entity that corresponds exactly to what Phaedrus called the parintellectual awareness. The subliminal self, Poincaré said, looks at a large number of solutions to a problem, but only the interesting ones break to the domain of consciousness. the interesting ones. Mathematical solutions are selected by subliminal self on the basis of mathematical beauty, of the harmony of numbers and forms, of geometric elegance. This is a true aesthetic feeling which all mathematicians know, Poincaré said, but which of the profane are so ignorant as often to be tempted to smile. But it is this harmony, this beauty, that is at the center of it all. Poincaré made it clear that he was not speaking of romantic beauty, the beauty of appearances which strikes the senses. He meant classical beauty, which comes from the harmonious order of the parts, in which the pure intelligence can grasp, which gives structure to the romantic beauty, and without which life would be only vague and fleeting, a dream from which one could not distinguish one's dreams, because there would be no basis for making the distinction. It is the quest of this special classical beauty, the sense of harmony of the cosmos, which makes us choose the facts most fitting to contribute to this harmony. It is not the facts, but the relation of things that results in the universal harmony that is the soul's objective reality. What guarantees the objectivity of the world in which we live is that this world is common to us with other thinking beings. Through the communications that we have with other men, we receive from them ready-made harmonious reasonings. We know that these reasonings do not come from us, and at the same time we recognize in them, because of their harmony, the work of reasonable beings like ourselves. And as these reasonings appear to fit the world of our sensations, we think we may infer that the reasonable beings have seen the same thing as we. Thus it is that we know we haven't been dreaming. It is this harmony, this quality, if you will, that is the sole basis for the only reality we will ever know. Poincaré's contemporaries refused to acknowledge that facts are pre-selected because they thought that to do so would destroy the validity of the scientific method. They presumed that pre-selected facts meant that the truth is whatever you like, and called his ideas conventionalism. They vigorously ignored the truth that their own principle of objectivity is not itself an observable fact. Therefore, their own criteria should be put in a state of suspended animation. They felt they had to do this because if they didn't, the entire philosophic underpinning of science would collapse. Poincaré didn't offer any resolutions of this collapse. Poincaré didn't offer any resolutions of this quandary. He didn't go far enough into the metaphysical implications of what he was saying to arrive at the solution. What he neglected to say was that the selection of facts before you observe them is whatever you like, only in a dualistic subject-object metaphysical system. When quality enters the picture, it's a third metaphysical entity. The pre-selection of facts is no longer arbitrary. The pre-selection of facts is based on subjective, capricious, whatever you like, but on quality, which is reality itself. Thus the quandary vanishes. It was as though Phaedrus had been working on a puzzle of his own because of the lack of time he had left one whole side unfinished. It was as though Phaedrus had been working on a puzzle of his own, and because of lack of time he had left one whole side unfinished. Poincaré had been working on a puzzle of his own. His judgment that the scientist selects facts, hypotheses, and axioms on the basis of harmony also left the rough, serrated edge of the puzzle incomplete. To leave the impression that the scientific world, the source of scientific reality, is merely a subjective, capricious harmony was to solve problems of epistemology, while leaving an unfinished edge at the border of metaphysics that makes the epistemology unacceptable. But we know from Phaedrus's metaphysics that the harmony Poincaré talked about was not subjective. It was the source of subjects and objects and exists as an interior relationship to them. It is not capricious. It is the force that opposes capriciousness, and ordering the principle of scientific and mathematical thought, which destroys capriciousness and without which no scientific thought can proceed. What brought tears of recognition to my eyes was the discovery that these unfinished edges match perfectly in any kind of harmony that both Phaedrus and Poincaré was talking about, to produce a complete structure of thought capable of uniting the separate languages of science and art into one. On either side of us, the mountains have become steep, to form a long, narrow valley that winds into the Missoula. This headwind has worn me down, and I'm tired now. Chris taps me and points it to the high hill with a large painted M on it, and I nod. This morning we passed one like it as we left Bozeman. A fragment occurs to me that the freshmen in each school go up there and paint the M each year. At a station where we fill with gas, a man with a trailer carrying 2 Appaloosa horses strikes up conversation. Most horse people are anti-motorcycle, it seems, but this one is not. He asks us a lot of questions, which I answer. Chris keeps asking to go up to the M, but I can see from here it's a steep, ruddy scrambler road with our highway machine and heavy load out, but I don't want to fool with it. We stretch our legs for a while, walk around, and then somewhat wearily head out of the Missoula toward Lolo Pass. A recollection appears that not so many years ago this road was all dirt and twists and turns from every rock and fold in the mountains. Now it's paved, and the turns are very broad. All the traffic we were in as evidently headed north for Kalispell or Cordiala, for there's hardly any now. We're headed southwest, have picked up the tailwind, and feel better because of it. The road starts to wind up into the pass. All traces of the east are gone now, at least in my imagination. All the rain here comes from Pacific winds, and the rivers and streams here return it to the Pacific. We should be at the ocean in at least 2 or 3 days. At Lolo Pass, we see a restaurant, and I pull up in front of it, beside the old Harley High Miler. It was a homemade Pinier on the back and 36,000 on the odometer. A real cross-country man. Oh my god. Inside, we fill up on pizza and milk, and then when finished, we leave right away. There's not much sunlight left, and a search for a campsite after dark is difficult and unpleasant. As we leave, we see a cross-country man by the cycles with his wife, and we say hello. He is from Missouri, and the relaxed look on his wife's face tell me they've been having a good trip. The man asks, were you bucking up that wind to Missoula too? I nod. Must have been 30 or 40 miles an hour. At least, he says. And we talk about camping for a while, and then comment about how cold it is. And they never dreamed Missouri would be this cold in the summer, even in the mountains. They have had to buy clothes and blankets. It shouldn't be too cold tonight, I say. We're only about 5,000 feet. Chris says, we're going to camp just down the road. At one of the campsites? No, we're just somewhere off the road, I say. They show no inclination of wanting to join us, so after I pause, I press the starter button and we wave off. On the road, the shadows of the mountain trees are long now. After 5 or 10 miles, we see some logging on the road turn-offs up ahead, and head up. The logging road is sandy, and I keep in low gear with my feet out to prevent a spill. We see roads off the main logging road, but I stay on the main one until after about a mile we come to some bulldozers. That means that they're still logging here. We turn back and head up one of the side roads, and after about half a mile we come to a tree fallen across the road. That's good. That means that this road has been abandoned. I say this is it to Chris, and he gets off. We're on the slope that allows us to see the unbroken forest for miles. Chris is all for exploring, but I'm so tired I just want to rest. You go by yourself, I say. No, you come along. I'm really tired, Chris. In the morning we'll explore. I untie the packs and spread out the sleeping bags on the ground, and Chris goes off. I stretch out, and the tiredness fills my arms and legs. Silent, beautiful forest. In time, Chris returns and says he has diarrhea. Oh, I say, and get up. Do you have to change underwear? Yes. He looks sheepish. Well, they're in my pack. They're in the pack in front by the motorcycle. Change and get a bar of soap from the saddlebag, and we'll go down the stream and wash the old underwear out. He's embarrassed by the whole thing, and now is glad to take orders. The downward slope of the road makes our feet flop as we head toward the stream. Chris shows me some stones he's collected while I've been sleeping, and the pine smell of the forest is rich here. It's turning cool, and the sun is very low. The silence and the fatigue and the sinking of the sun depresses me a little, but I keep it to myself. After Chris has washed out the underwear and has it completely clean, we wrung it out and head back up the logging road. As we climb it, I get a sudden depressed feeling that I've been walking up this logging road all my life. Dad? What? A small bird rises from a tree in front of us. What should I be when I grow up? The bird disappears over a far ridge. I don't know what to say. Honest, I finally say. I mean, what kind of job? Any kind. What do you get mad at? What do you get mad? Why do you get mad when I ask that? I'm not mad. I just think, I don't know. I'm just too tired to think, and it doesn't matter what you do. Roads like this one get smaller and smaller and then quit. Later I notice he's not keeping up. The sun below the horizon now in twilight is the sun is below the horizon now, and twilight is on us. We walk separately back up the logging road, and when we reach the cycle, we climb into sleeping bags and without a word go to sleep.